iron and fire, timber and rail. The Colorado Midland forged the line, settled the towns, and helped introduce the world to the Wild West. The mighty Midland. And the towns it built.
Wow, Charlie, to think back in 1859, this shiny nugget sparked a new chapter for Colorado.
That's right, Christy. And with the discovery of gold, Payne the genius calculated risks of these iron pioneers that dared to achieve something that's just never been done before.
Built a standard gauge railroad that pierced the Rockies and climbed the heights over 11,000 feet.
Blasted through 3 mountain ranges, endured blizzards and avalanches that buried the line for weeks.
To the pater that waited for them at the end of the line.
So, witness the triumphant tragedy of the Colorado Midland Railway.
And what a tale this will be. We'll catch up with Charlie and Christy as well as the Ute Pass Historical Society and some unique train historians a little farther down the line. Now, the Colorado Midland was not the first railroad to make tracks in the state of Colorado. That was made possible by the Transcontinental Union Pacific that reached the state in 1867. In fact, since the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, movement to settle the West began, and by 1830 the first tracks were laid in the U.S. The next evolution of transportation began. Over the following 20 years, nearly 9,000 miles of tracks were built in America. Industry and population centers began to rise up around the terminal stations of railroads in major cities like Chicago and Salt Lake City. The combination of the railways, the California Gold Rush, and the Industrial Revolution were the catalyst to the expansion of the West. And when the Pikes Peak or Bust Gold Rush hit Colorado, the trains came too. Several railroad lines competed in Colorado not only to reach the mines, but also the coal fields, a key element which fueled the mighty engine of the steam train. In the more rugged terrain of Colorado, there was a need for these narrow-gauge railroads to be constructed. As the name implies, they could maneuver more easily through higher elevations, making tighter turns, simpler climbs, and quite frankly, were cheaper to build. Their downfall was that the engine and freight cars were smaller and limited in hauling capacity. But don't take my word for it. Let's check in with Mel McFarland, the man who literally wrote the book about the mighty Midland.
When they started building to Colorado, the challenge was the fact that the state had already been networked with narrow gauge railroads. Now, narrow gauge railroads were easy to build. They could build them in places where standard gauge couldn't be built. But a freight car destined for places in the mountains of Colorado, if it normally came to Denver or Pueblo, would have to be transloaded into a smaller narrow gauge car, where things had to be taken off the standard gauge cars and stacked on narrow gauge cars. Standard gauge being 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rail, it's a third bigger than a narrow gauge car. They could bring a car from Chicago or St. Louis to Colorado and take it on through the state on the standard gauge railroads and then out the west side of the state. So traffic that was being transferred through Wyoming could now come through Colorado.
And herein lies the tale of how a group of men, led by two visionaries, had an idea that would change the scope of everything. Introducing James J. Hagerman, an industrialist from the Midwest. He became the business manager of the Milwaukee Iron Company in 1863, just 2 years after graduating college. He increased the output of the train rails being produced by the factory and, in turn, made the company highly profitable. In 1881, Hagerman contracted pulmonary tuberculosis. He and his family moved to Switzerland for treatments, trying to slow down the progression of his illness. He was not successful. On advice from his doctor, he moved to an up-and-coming sanctuary for those dealing with consumption, Colorado. In 1884, they returned to the U.S. and moved to Colorado Springs, where he honestly thought he was coming to die. The death rate for tuberculosis was well known at that time, but he hoped the dry air and high altitude would improve his health.
For some reason in the 1800s, it became the leading cause of death. And they call it consumption, the White Plague, the White Death. So it affected a lot of people. There was no real known treatment except for fresh air, sunshine, and high altitude. They did find that that would reduce the spread. So when you're looking to save your family members, you'll do what it takes, and Colorado was one of the perfect places to come because we got it all. We got 300 days of sunshine a year, we've got the high altitude and the clean air. So they came in droves. In fact, it kind of built the state. And they said at one point 1 in 3 Coloradoans had consumption. It went from being the Wild West of people escaping the law and gamblers and miners to now respected businessmen with wealth. And they came to the state and they invested in it. Now, in our personal town here of Woodland Park, almost every single business that was started on our main street had someone in their family that had tuberculosis.
Colorado would be known as the world's sanatorium. What an odd mixture, having a population boom that was comprised of the fortune hunters seeking wealth, or the weak and weary seeking health. Wealth is what Hagerman already had, and miraculously, health is what he received. And as his health improved, he soon set his sights on this newfound city that gave him a second chance. Hagerman built a mansion in Colorado Springs, aptly named the Hagerman Mansion. He quickly became involved in local businesses and was looking for a challenge. As fate would have it, the industrialist stopped in the one place where all major projects landed: the bank. In this case, the First National Bank of Colorado Springs. With his experience in the business of iron production, mining, and town development, Hagerman was ground zero for what would be one of the most ambitious projects in railroad history for Colorado. Now let's introduce Irving Howbert, one of the earliest and most influential settlers in the region. During his lifetime, Howbert was involved in mining, banking, railroads, and politics, eventually serving as a senator for the Republican Party for the state. Like Hagerman, he had a shrewd business mind. At the time, he was the president of the First National Bank of Colorado Springs when Hagerman walked through the doors.
One of the more interesting characters in Colorado history is Irving Howbert. He came to Colorado with his parents as a child just after the gold rush of 1859. They settled in the Pikes Peak region to ranch, and he got interested in real estate. And when General Palmer was looking for right-of-way for his railroad, Howbert was the man he contacted, and Howbert was busy finding properties for General Palmer, and included a lot of property in the Pikes Peak region. One of those just happened to be Garden of the Gods, and he became one of the prominent bankers in Colorado Springs. But when General Palmer was moving on, along came another gentleman, James J. Hagerman, and lo and behold, he joined Irving Howbert in the banking industry. And he learned of the project of building this railroad across the middle of Colorado rather than going around. And Howbert took him around and showed him what his ideas were, and it enthused Hagerman. And suddenly, instead of the Colorado Midland being Howbert's railroad, it was Hagerman's railroad.
Howbert knew Hagerman's expertise would be exactly what was needed to build the Colorado Midland Railway. Hagerman became a major stakeholder in the bank and was appointed president of the Colorado Midland Project. What he proposed next would alter the game dramatically. The mines in Leadville were the prize, and already two narrow-gauge carriers, the Denver and Rio Grande and the Denver, South Park, and Pacific, serviced the fledgling town. However, their routes took longer than the proposed Midlands, and Hagerman knew competing with these lines would mean building a standard gauge railroad through the Rockies.
So Charlie, Hagerman, he was aware of the stranglehold the other two lines had on Leadville. He was like, boys, it's time to step it up and fund this operation.
Well, this move intimidated the other two lines, so they immediately doubled the rates on the shipping supplies for the Midland.
Good old Hagerman, he didn't want to depend on the other lines. Instead, he found other ways to get his supplies, staying one step ahead of the game.
So the chess match began. And if the other two lines couldn't stop the Midland, they'd certainly try to slow them down.
Oh, Hagerman, he outsmarted them, secured their position, and brought victory to the group. Checkmate.
Got me again, Christy.
The first construction contracts for the Midland were awarded in 1886, and Hagerman had a divide and conquer approach. Construction of the grade over the Continental Divide at what became Hagerman Pass began. At almost 12,000 feet, workers bore through 2,000 feet of mountainside, creating one of the highest train tunnels ever built. The Hagerman Tunnel was an engineering feat, and the pass to get there was a series of enormous wooden trestles called the Great Loop, which wound precariously through the demanding terrain. When the tunnel opened, journalist W.A. Douglas exclaimed, "This is the gateway through the Great Divide, a portal to the West." Over the course of construction, court battles, red tape, and even armed guards blocking surveyors became commonplace. This was still the Wild West. And as the other railroad lines continued to challenge the completion of the build, Hagerman had construction revert back to where the line began in Colorado City. Competing lines were one thing, but Mother Nature wasn't going to be left out of this fight either. Another key element to make this train a reality, besides coal, was water, and that was a rare commodity in Colorado. Hagerman had an idea of how to ensure that he had enough water to quench the thirst of his massive locomotives and meet the needs of the growing settlements that were taking route up and down the line. Man-made lakes were dug at strategic locations where he would build water towers along with depots. The water would be supplied by the Fountain Creek, which fed the towns along the Ute Pass. And when the depots came, so did growth. The Midland was about to cut through the Rockies and transform the settlements and homesteads into cities and towns. Our first stop along the Ute Pass is Cascade.
3 sisters from New York homesteaded the area in the early 1880s. Eliza Hewlett, the oldest of the 3, moved her 2 children and sisters from Schenectady.
Well, now these 3 ladies, well, they were called women of leisure back then.
Charlie, are you saying those leisurely ladies were lazy like us?
Well, actually, Christy, women of leisure back in that era, those ladies just didn't have to work. And it's safe to say that Eliza, who was a widow, she was left with enough money to support her and her children for the rest of their lives.
Well, according to history, there was nothing leisurely about her. Back before women could even vote, she was developing a town, which demonstrated her strength, wit, and determination.
Well, in 1886, back when the Midland was building a depot here,
She knew progress was coming.
She started the Cascade Town Company. They built a post office and the East Home Hotel in 1887. The company also contributed to the cost of developing the Pikes Peak Carriage Road.
Her son, Edward, who was the manager of the company, surveyed and built the carriage road in 1888.
While the carriage road was being completed, she constructed 2 more hotels in the area. The most notable was a Ramona, a 93-room, 3-story resort-style hotel named after the novel by Helen Hunt, who wrote her famous work not far from Cascade.
The timing could not have been better. Within 2 years, she transformed this scenic canyon into a resort town.
Her collaboration with the Colorado Midland Railway solidified Cascade as a vacation destination. The combination of the carriage road, the resort hotels, and the train depot brought visitors to Cascade every year, many of them to take the carriage ride to the summit of the peak. The most famous of these passengers was Catherine Lee Bates, who after seeing the view from the top of the mountain was inspired to write the words for America the Beautiful. Back on the line, Hagerman completed the connections to Aspen and was almost to Grand Junction. With the railroad fully established, the towns along the Ute Pass flourished. The Midland's primary goal was to get to the gold, silver, and coal mines. But passenger business and resort stops along the line would draw thousands a year and be quite lucrative. Next stop, Green Mountain Falls. The writing was on the wall, and when developer W.J. Foster got wind that the Midland Railroad was going through this beautiful valley, he purchased the land from local ranchers in 1887.
William Foster was a Colorado Springs businessman. He's also the one that established Green Mountain Falls. When he saw that the Midland Railroad was going to be heading west to the mountains, he immediately decided that there was going to have to be a town, a resort town, a place where people could stay. And so he went looking, and he found this beautiful mountain valley that had waterfalls, a stream running through it, mountains, trees, everything you could possibly want, and he knew this was the place. He knew also that he was going to need a lot of money to build all these places, so he established the town company, and together they started building cloth cabins. These were cabins with a wooden base and a canvas walls, and they were supplied with basic things that anybody who would want to do rustic camping would like. They built about 100 of those. In the meantime, he was thinking that they really needed a lake there, not only for the Midland, for entertainment, for all the people that were going to come there. They built a beautiful lake, and they had an island in the middle of it, and they put a gazebo on the top of it. While they were building places around there, other people wanted to have summer homes that they could come back to, so they ended up building a lot of homes and cabins. In 1889, they built a beautiful hotel. It was called the Green Mountain Falls Hotel. It was a 3-story place. It had verandas outside of every room and the most amazing view for everyone that stayed there. The Midland partnered with the town company to do excursions. They decided to bring people from Kansas and southern Colorado, along with all the other people coming to Green Mountain Falls. There were picnics, there were sailboat races, tub races, hiking, just about anything you could think of. The hotels sponsored dinners and teas, and then there was a balloonist. He was an intrepid fellow. He kept trying to fly over the mountains there, and he didn't know that the prevailing winds were in the opposite direction. So he never made it over the mountains, but he landed in the lake. The people said that his vocabulary was tremendous and his lung power great, and they could hear him quite a ways away. Fortunately, he was a good swimmer, so he was able to swim to shore and he didn't drown.
The partnership between Foster and the Midland was so successful that the Midland built a Y.
Charlie, are you talking about the YMCA?
No, it's more like a W-Y-E, really. It wasn't shaped like a Y at all. It was more like a triangle. And the idea of that was to allow the train to turn around.
Wasn't that a clever idea? I mean, a much better way than waiting for the train to track back down the pass to pick the passengers up.
That's right. And, you know, Green Mountain Falls became such a well-known destination that at the height of its business, they were running trains from Colorado Springs every 2 hours.
Well, isn't that just smart business sense? By 1900, Green Mountain Falls had several hotels, 3 grocery stores, a church, an ice house, and much, much more.
Ice houses? Those guests must have been thirsty.
Well, not really, but we'll catch up to that story a little farther up the line.
All right, let's keep this train rolling.
The Colorado Midland Railway advertisements, brochures, and marketing were second to none. They even had their own band, which played events all along the line as a way to entertain the passengers and guests.
The Midland Band played every Sunday throughout the summer months right here in this very gazebo. They wore buckskin uniforms representing the Ute Indian tribe.
Also, guest speaker Reverend Talmadge from Brooklyn, New York, was invited by the Midland Railway. He preached to an audience of 2,000 while his inspirational choir took the stage.
Well, they certainly covered all their bases. And you know, they had many logos over the years. The most famous was the Midland Indian
Logo?
That's right, Christy.
The Colorado Midlands Advertising Group also donned the Rocky Mountain Lion to represent the wildlife that was indigenous to the area. Their brochures were in all the major train depots around the United States, and even as far as Europe. The West was open, and a curious world wanted to see it with their own eyes. The mighty Midland offered hunting, fishing, and breathtaking sightseeing tours, as well as resort stays and excursions, ranging from the adventurous to the refined.
And the Colorado Midland had one of the best advertising agencies in-house that you can imagine. They had fine dining cars. You would come into the dining car, and here in front of you would be Colorado Midland china and glassware and silverware. If you walked into a station, they had huge pictures of scenic points all along the Colorado Midland, little brochures that came out almost monthly. Today, these are all collector's items, and there's a vast collection scattered all over the world of Colorado Midland advertising.
During the Midland's reign, it had over 67 locomotives, 80 passenger cars, and 140 maintenance cars, including freight cars, plows, and supporting equipment. It was a massive operation that had to be orchestrated down to the minute.
They had something like 40 railroad stations, but at any one time there could be 5, 6, 7, 8 passenger trains rolling from Colorado Springs and Grand Junction on the west toward each other, past each other. Mixed in here were freight trains, but the key point is passenger trains. The passenger trains on the Colorado Midland were not only fabulous, but they were important because they moved everybody. You could get on a train somewhere in the east, get in a sleeping car, and stay on that sleeping car until you got to your destination, which might be Seattle or even Los Angeles.
The Colorado Midland had constructed 267 miles of track from 1886 to 1888. Those tracks, which were the very foundation of the line, helped create the very foundation of the towns it built. Our next stop, well, just wasn't supposed to be one, but I think I'll let Charlie pick up the tale of our next town.
There was one town up the Ute Pass that wasn't part of the Midlands plan, but with the help of a crystal ball, and the Brotherhood Mine and Milling Company, plans changed.
Oh, Charlie, please do tell me more.
Our next stop's Cristola. With the powers of former Illinois House of Representatives Henry Childs and his colony of spiritualists, they saw a bright future for the town, gleaming with visions of gold.
The spiritualist movement was a religious and social movement that spanned decades. It was a belief that the living could communicate with the dead. During and after the Civil War, there was this immense loss of life, and grieving families were eager to communicate with the loved ones that they had lost. In fact, by probably the 1870s, it was estimated that there were over 8 million followers in the United States and Europe alone. Such figures as Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes novels, Queen Victoria, Thomas Edison, Mary Todd Lincoln, and even Mae West. In fact, Mary Todd Lincoln is reported to have had a seance in the White House that Abraham Lincoln attended. They were grieving the death of their son, Todd. So in the midst of this movement, here comes this mysterious man named Henry Clay Childs. He's a successful businessman in Chicago, and besides his political life, he owned a mechanical bakery, he invested in real estate, and he ran a toy factory, which unfortunately burned to the ground when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern and caused the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Imagine how devastated he was, because a major source of his livelihood went up in smoke. Well, a medium friend convinced him, really, that he ought to move out west and start over. And so that's what they did. He and his wife, Catherine, moved to central Colorado in an area just west of Ute Pass that he called Cristola, and started a new life. He built a modest white frame house back up in one of the canyons, and they ran some cattle, and he invited friends over occasionally, and they would have seances in his house. So there is a mystery about Childs. His idea was to create a community of spiritualists who would use their gifts to bring fortune and fortune-telling to the gold-rich area that was around him. Later in life, Childs' reputation grew, and he was called by one of the Denver newspapers the Tolstoy of the West, after the famous author of War and Peace. And Childs held to those religious and pacifist views that Leo Tolstoy wrote about in his book, The Kingdom of God Within You.
Childs continued to expand his settlement, and soon other psychics and mediums called Cristola home. The original name of the area was Trout Creek, but Henry and his wife renamed the community Cristola after Henry's beloved crystal ball. Along with the cattle ranch, Childs put his business practices to use and built a small lumber mill. He was holding seances and spiritual gatherings at their house on a regular basis. During one session, a visiting psychic revealed that there was gold in the Ute Pass area. Childs created the Cristola Brotherhood Mine and Milling Company and built a small ore processing mill, where they used cyanide to extract the gold from the ore. Around the same time, the Colorado Midland laid their tracks a little farther down the valley. Childs knew that the heartbeat of a town was the railroad, and though the Midland was not planning on building a depot there, Childs and his group offered to build a flag depot for them where the train only stopped if a flag was displayed. It signaled the picking up or dropping off passengers and freight. News of gold and mystic visions flooded the area, and soon Cristola was bustling with workers, tricksters, and psychics, all eager to stake their claim, or con, on those who were stricken with gold fever. Childs and his friends began to offer services to potential prospectors, outlining their plan for finding gold through psychic means. Dollars poured into the town from hopeful investors, And what soon followed was one of the most notorious stock-selling schemes in Colorado history. Childs offered shares in the Cristola Cooperative Association, an industrial group allowing investors access to their very own psychic, who was supposedly able to locate the undiscovered gold veins in the area.
For a substantial fee, a wizard, yes, a wizard, would mystically identify a gold deposit using a willow stick to witch the location of that shiny ore.
So, which switch is which?
Your guess is as good as mine, Christy.
Folks invested more money into town stocks, hoping to create a bonanza of riches.
Well, they did have some success finding metal deposits in the Cristola area, but ultimately their vision just fell flat. So there's no gold discovered in them there hills.
Suffice to say, the wizarding world of Cristola didn't amount to a hill of beans.
I guess they didn't see that in their crystal ball.
I guess not. Next stop, Woodland Park.
Well, to paint the picture of Woodland Park, we first need to talk about Manitou Park. Founded by a doctor from England who helped create the health resort of Manitou Springs. Dr. William Bell, a capitalist and developer from England, purchased land for his next resort town, just north of what is now called Woodland Park in the 1870s.
In 1871, when General Palmer was building the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, one of his close associates was Dr. William A. Bell. Bell and Palmer had met when General Palmer was actually working on building and then designing a transcontinental railroad for what would be a rival to the Union Pacific. And Dr. Bell got real excited about the prospect of seeing the West in raw form. When they started building in Colorado, Dr. Bell came with General Palmer and was a close associate and helped him develop communities all along the way. One of the more interesting communities that Dr. Bell developed was Manitou Park. They had visions of building a new town at the base of Pikes Peak. Irving Howbert showed them this property way up above Ute Pass, where there was plenty of big, tall, sturdy trees, and they started a lumbering company. They contacted one of their suppliers for railroad ties, a fellow by the name of Dewey Fisher, and asked him if he would consider coming up into the mountains and starting a sawmill. And Fisher had the idea that they could use some of the older Denver and Rio Grande locomotives that had now proven to be too small up there to help bring the timber from the forest to a sawmill they were building. This worked out just fine, except they had to get this little steam engine up Ute Pass, which at the time was a terrible thing, but they took it apart and brought it up and operated on this little railroad, which nobody had a name for. When they were developing an idea for expansion, Irving Howbert suggested that they connect it to his idea for a railroad, and they could build up Ute Pass, connect it to the lumber company railroad, and go on west. But at the time, General Palmer was slowly being forced out of ownership of the Denver and Rio Grande by one of the eastern moguls, and he wanted no part of building up Ute Pass. So the whole idea died, and eventually the little logging railroad, they ran out of lumber and it died. And it quietly disappeared.
There was good reason for that, too. Dewey's logging operation was quoted to have cut the park from one end to the other, leave nothing behind plan, and over the next decade they did just that. Key elements for operating a railroad were coal, iron, water, and timber. Woodland Park became the epicenter for that precious commodity. By 1885, there were 5 lumber mills operating in the Woodland Park region. and by 1891, Woodland Park incorporated as a town. The mills had cut around 100 million board feet of lumber while they were in operation. In fact, to build 1 mile of track back in that day took 3,000 railroad ties weighing in at 200 pounds apiece.
Now, we all usually think of the term lumberjacks, but lumberjack is a Canadian term for the loggers. Timber beast was a local term because you had to be a big burly kind of guy to be a timber beast. The other thing was a tie hacker, and a tie hacker is making actually the railroad ties. And locally, the tie hacking was something that a lot of ranchers would do to supplement their income. It's not easy to grow things up here. It's a very arid climate. So lumbering was very big here. There were sawmills all over the place. People were racking it in. You'd see stacks of lumber over there next to the depot, the train depot, but they were going a little bit too far. They were eviscerating the forest. Fortunately, someone stepped in, and in 1892, they did make it a preserve so that we could save some of this forest that we can still now enjoy today. 185,000 acres were saved to become what is now known as the Pike Peak National Forest.
Woodland Park was expanding. Within 2 years from when Howbert approached Dewey and Bell with the idea of his railroad cutting through the pass, the Colorado Midland Railway, under the new leadership of James J. Hagerman, built its depot in Woodland Park. Commerce emerged along the main street. Hotels and shops began dotting the landscape. Schools and churches were raised, solidifying the permanence of the town. Citizens, however, wary of the ways of Cripple Creek, wanted to set a precedence and built this structure as a warning.
So the first building that was built in Woodland Park was actually the jail. When the city first formed in 1891, Cripple Creek had just found gold, and some of the locals, they didn't really like the stuff that was happening in Cripple Creek. So for their new town, they wanted it to be held to higher moral standards. So one of the first things they did was put in a set of rules. One of the rules was that they put in a fine, a $100 fine for lewd or nude clothing out on the streets. And they also outlawed gambling and prostitution in city limits. Drunk and disorderly conduct came with a fine and jail time. Also, alcohol couldn't be sold anywhere within a mile of city limits except a drugstore for medical purposes.
With order established in this growing town, another building that became quite popular to the local citizens and the passengers of the Midland was the Woodland Park Midland Hotel. In particular, its restaurant. On opening day in 1892, the hotel impressed its patrons by serving drinks with ice cubes.
Aha! Ice houses, right?
Well, sort of. We have one more stop along the Ute Pass where I'll explain everything.
Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense. Ice houses, ice cubes, cold drinks, happy people.
True, but there's a bit more to this story.
Well, you know, it's really impressive to be able to offer your guests ice. Only the wealthy could afford such a luxury, right?
Charlie, I'm not giving you any more hints.
I know you won't.
Next stop, Divide. Originally called Hayden's Divide after Ferdinand Van de Veer Hayden. He was a geologist and paleontologist that helped to map the region. Local settlers to the area just called it Divide. Incidentally, it was Hayden that led the first federally funded geological expedition into Yellowstone appointed by President Roosevelt.
You know, the locals in Divide call their community the center of the known universe.
Was this another spiritualist community like Christola?
Well, it's definitely very peaceful with breathtaking views, but no, it's actually more geological than spiritual. The Arkansas and South Platte aquifers divide this area.
Okay, but did you know there was another geological feature in Divide once called the Panama Canal?
Are you kidding me? First ice houses, now Panama Canal? Do you have any other surprises for me, little lady?
You'll just have to wait and see.
Divide was already an important transportation hub before the Midland laid tracks here in 1887. Herds of cattle were driven through town on their way up to South Park, while shipments of raw timber moved down the pass to the mills in Woodland Park. Hagerman also relied heavily on Divide's transports. Now, when cattle or timber had to be moved, they used his iron ponies to do the job. Hauling cattle became another lucrative stream of income for the Colorado Midland.
One of the biggest cattle ranches in the area was the Crescent Ranch. It had 25,000 acres and 2,000 or more head of cattle. The Midland Railroad came through that property east to west, and there was a spur to a great big corral with a cattle chute where they would load cattle from the ranch, put them on the train, and then ship them all over the U.S. Another lesser-known story about the Crescent Ranch is that Tom Mix, an old-time silent movie star, was a cowhand there. Not only that, he taught John Wayne, the Duke, a Western movie star, how to be a cowboy.
The train just didn't bring movie stars to the area, but when it passed through Divide, so did the Panama Canal.
Come on, Christy, spill it already.
I'll leave that one up to our train experts to finish the tale.
The original Midland Depot in Divide, which was built in 1887, burned down, sources say around 1898. And after that, for about 5 or 6 years, the Colorado Midland perhaps operated out of a small freight depot. But in 1903, 1904, they decided that they needed to build a new depot in the Y between the Colorado Midland tracks and the Midland Terminal tracks, and also to straighten out the tracks going over Ute Pass. And so engineers came in and they devised a pretty deep cut over the crest of Ute Pass. And they brought in these huge steam shovels, which the local workers called the whole operation the Panama Canal, because they were the same steam shovels that they used to build the canal down in Central America.
At last, I finally know.
And we're in it right now.
Well, can you imagine a mighty Midland just chugging along? And this once former Panama Canal is now just a dirt road.
Well, I bet you didn't know there was one other source of income the Midland tapped into.
Well, they already had mining and freight, plus passenger and resort service, plus cattle and supplies, plus
my favorite, veggies.
Is there nothing they wouldn't think of?
If they could ship it, they would ship it.
Well, the Midland could ship produce locally and make some money, but these guys have big ideas, and they would want to go further.
Always further.
And to ship produce long distances and keep the produce fresh, they would need ice.
Charlie, you connected the dots. You never cease to amaze me.
Well, Christy, you threw me off with this whole Panama Canal thing.
All along the line, at various stops, the Midland built ice houses to store huge blocks of ice that were cut from frozen lakes during the winter.
Now, with the mystery of the ice houses and Panama Canal behind us, let's forge ahead and discover why Divide was also once known as the lettuce capital of the world. Throughout the year, they packed the ice with the produce in specially designed cars. The sawdust produced from the local mills in Woodland Park was utilized to insulate the ice houses and freight cars to ensure fresh storage and delivery. The produce grown right on these hillsides was shipped to major metropolises like Chicago and Los Angeles.
By 1920, the Divide area was called the lettuce capital of the world. They had lettuce as big around as bushel baskets. And the old timers remember people in New York City eating salad from lettuce from Divide. The potatoes were fantastic. They had no blight. They set aside 13,000 acres to raise those potatoes. and it became a commercial farming area. It was just in time because the rest of the country really needed produce, so Divide was able to provide that. Divide became not only a crossroads for water, but also for commerce. The Midland Railroad loaded up ore and produce and cattle and lumber and carried it to the new depot in Divide, where it was shipped all over the U.S.
The Midland Depot in Divide is an interesting structure because it served two railroads, which was part of a large interconnecting transportation system that spanned nearly 6 decades. It included the Colorado Midland Railway and the Midland Terminal Railroad, which served the Gold District in Cripple Creek and Victor. When James J. Hagerman was elected president of the paper railroad that was the Colorado Midland, he was able to raise $20 million to build the railroad, which was finished in 1888. It spanned over 230 miles all the way eventually to Grand Junction, where it could interconnect with other railroads. And it was the first standard gauge railroad that pierced the Intercontinental Divide just west of Leadville. Up until that time, all of the railroads were narrow gauge. But railroads, even back in that time, were very expensive to operate. And when you consider all the infrastructure that was required to build the Colorado Midland through the terrain that it had to go through, tunnels and bridges, and it became very evident to Hagerman that he had to do something, because in their first year, they had spent all this $20 million. They'd only received or earned about $1 million. And he knew that if he was ever going to be able to extract all his friends who had invested in his railroad and at least break even, he was going to have to sell it. The railroad was on the verge of bankruptcy already. And so it did. In December of 1890, he sold the railroad to the Santa Fe. And Hagerman went on to pursue his mining interests and an irrigation project that was developing down in New Mexico. And the Santa Fe continued to operate the Midland as the Colorado Midland Railroad.
The Santa Fe knew the Colorado Midland already built its legacy by being the first railroad to open travel and services through the West by way of the Rocky Mountains. By keeping the name of the Colorado Midland Railway, the Santa Fe ensured that people from around the world would come to explore the Rockies. The spirit of the Midland lived on. But in order to complete this tale, we'll have to touch on the Midland Terminal branch, and the one man who later saved the CMR when it was in trouble again. Our final stop, Cripple Creek.
We've seen some amazing characters that took the bull by its horns and developed the towns as the mighty Midland cut its way through the pass.
And even though the stories about the towns along the Ute Pass may be over, the stories about the Midland isn't quite finished yet.
Welcome to Cripple Creek, where gold flourished, prosperity boomed, a king reigned, and a train transported it all.
Introducing Albert E. Carlton, an entrepreneur from Illinois. Like Hagerman, Carlton moved to Colorado, hoping to survive the White Death, tuberculosis. He did, and using his background in freighting and shipping, he latched onto the gold boom in Cripple Creek. He and his brother started a business called the Colorado Trading and Transfer Company. By 1891, he was using teams of horses and wagons to transport supplies needed in the mining town. They would haul freight from the Midland's depot in Divide to the Gold District. Over the next several years, Carlton invested in mines, banks, and railroads, quickly becoming a business mogul. And when the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893 happened, the price of silver crashed nationwide. Silver mines rapidly shut down, and the exodus began. Miners and investors saw Cripple Creek as a life raft in the middle of the storm. In 1895, the Midland Terminal was complete, and the branch line from Divide to the Gold District was open. The first major gold reduction mill was being built in Colorado City. The timing was perfect for the Midland. This also worked well for Carleton, who had slowly purchased most of the mines in the area. In 1914, he started a powerful syndicate of like-minded businessmen, including Spencer Penrose, called the Cripple Creek Central Leadership. Local papers hailed Carleton the king of Cripple Creek for what happened next.
One of the more tragic parts of the history of Colorado Midland and Ute Pass is World War I. Several things were going on about this time before the war, and the biggest one that was affecting every railroad across the United States was the switch from driving on trains to riding in automobiles. And passenger service went into a decline. As is the case, maintenance declined. As the amount of money it cost increased, the number of men they had available, the amount of money they had to make repairs declined. And by World War I, Colorado Midland was in trouble. They were still hauling a lot of freight, and in this area, one of the more important prospects was Cripple Creek, which had started in 1891. When World War I developed, the U.S. government took over operation of all the railroads. One of the more interesting things that they did was they also shut down all the mines in the mining areas because they didn't need gold. They needed lead for bullets and zinc for bullets and things like that. And that wasn't a big product in Colorado. The idea was to get military traffic to the coasts as fast as possible, and everything else could wait. They looked at the Colorado Midland, which was a reasonable straight line across the middle of Colorado, and this should be where they go. Well, Colorado Midland wasn't in good shape. So trains got stuck while they worked on tracks. And all of a sudden the government was saying, why can't our trains get across this track faster? And when the Midland explained the problems, they had a solution. They took all the traffic away from the Colorado Midland. Everything went to the Union Pacific up in Wyoming, and some of it went to the Denver and Rio Grande, but the Colorado Midland had nothing. So they were going to scrap it. And they put it up for sale. And they expected at the sale, scrapping companies would be the main customers. But there was one gentleman there who had a big interest in saving the Colorado Midland, and that was Bert Carleton. He looked at the Colorado Midland as a possible resurrection of some of the ideas that Irving, Howbert, and James J. Hagerman had that had never been developed. Carleton came along and put in a bid of $1.5 million and outbid the scrap dealers, and he became the owner of the Colorado Midland. He started a big project for redeveloping the Midland, but military traffic was still coming through after the war, and they were still having delays. And the government was upset, and they shut it all down. And everything west of Divide was scrapped. East of Divide, they still needed a connection for the Midland Terminal, which started in Cripple Creek and came to Divide to get down into Colorado Springs so they could connect to the big gold mill that they were using in Colorado City.
Carleton was forced to file for bankruptcy, and in 1918, the first standard gauge railway to pierce the Rockies was dismantled. It was the largest dismantling of a railway line in the history of our country. Carleton tried to sue the government for the losses it incurred, but it was too little too late. In a short span of 11 months, the Midland's nearly 200 miles of tracks were torn up west of Divide to Grand Junction and sold for scrap. The Midland Terminal continued basic services until 1949, when the gold processing mill closed in Colorado City. The last remnant of the Colorado Midland Railway was no more.
Oh, Charlie, really? You shouldn't have.
Well, Christy, you did great.
but I just don't want to see our tale end on a sad note.
I understand, but even though the mighty Midland came to an end, it had one more notable excursion that was literally world class. You want to take a guess?
Bigfoot hunting.
Not even close. I think there's more than meets the eye to these wildflowers. But Charlie, I'm pretty for sure you already knew that.
Well, maybe.
Well, to find out, you and I will have to go along for one more ride.
Hey, you know, that sounds great to me, Christy. But first, smile.
Cheese.
Oh, that looks great.
Thanks, Charlie.
That'll be 2 bits, little lady.
Aw, thanks, Charlie.
Now, we've already talked about the incredible marketing campaign that the Midland ran to attract tourists to the Rockies. But there was one that spanned the globe, their famous Wildflower Excursion. Tourists and locals would take the journey from Colorado Springs to the wildflower fields, just north of what is now 11 Mile Canyon. It was a 115-mile round trip through the Rockies to the high plains where in the summer wildflowers bloomed. Originally started by a church group in 1887, this excursion went from serving hundreds of people locally to thousands from all over the world by 1917. What made this excursion unique, besides the wildflowers, was that there was a photographer on board who would take pictures of the passengers. Then he would develop them by the time they made it back to the terminal in Colorado City. Photos that weren't purchased were used for postcards and brochures that made it to train depots across the country and as far away as Europe. People from around the world were compelled to head west and take part in their very own mountain adventure. These excursions became so popular that they grew from weekends to everyday events in order to accommodate all of the wide-eyed travelers. When the Midland was continuing construction of its tracks through Divide toward Grand Junction, it blasted out the side of a hill in a small community called Florissant. In the process, they exposed a huge fossil deposit. There had already been fossils and petrified tree stumps discovered in Florissant by none other than Ferdinand Hayden. But with the Midland running through the 34-million-year-old fossil deposits, it became part of the Wildflower Excursion adventure. Now, while passengers were stretching their legs, they could try their luck at finding fossils that were scattered throughout the area. In fact, years later, Walt Disney purchased a petrified sequoia stump for his theme park. The entire journey took about 3 hours and cost $1 per passenger. The gateway to the west was open to big cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Visitors wanted a safe, comfortable, and luxurious way to travel into the front range of the Rocky Mountains and get a taste of the natural, awe-inspiring beauty that Colorado had to offer. In the span of just over 31 years, the Colorado Midland Railway rose to fame, put many small towns along the line on the map, survived buyouts, failures, and changing of hands. It delivered produce to growing cities across the country and fattened the purses of wealthy entrepreneurs with gold and silver. They created excursions for both the daring and the meek, all with the fragrance of wildflowers filling the summertime air. They shipped cattle and timber to build the growing towns, fought the elements and even the government to keep the train on its tracks.
This was the triumph and tragedy of the Colorado Midland. And though its piercing whistle echoes no more along these canyon walls,
Its legacy endures.
and in these former tunnels, the ghostly remnants of iron and coal still remains.
Reminding us how the train that forged the line connected us all together.
So thank you for joining us as we learned about the mighty Midland and the towns it built.
We just scratched the surface of rich history and epic tales of this amazing railway. We also took a glimpse into the towns along the Ute Pass that were born right here in the shadow of Pikes Peak.
Till next time, folks.